When he stepped into the courtroom, the mood shifted the way it does when a storm cloud covers the sun. People didn't turn all at once. They noticed him in a slow wave, like a murmur moving down a church pew. He pushed the door with his shoulder, but the security officer was already there, pulling it wide for him. No eye contact, no thank you. Just a nod that felt more like an order than acknowledgement. He walked past the line of people waiting with citations in their hands as if they were furniture, not neighbors. He looked like money that never had to earn itself. Sneakers that cost more than some folks' first cars. Jeans that were ripped in all the right places, not from work. A designer hoodie hanging loose, hood up just enough to look careless, not enough to hide. One earbud in, the other dangling against his collarbone, music faintly ticking, like a metronome of disrespect. Near the clerk's desk, a woman in her late 60s clutched her ticket and leaned toward the man beside her. "Who does he think he is?" she whispered. The man didn't answer. His jaw tightened, the way it tightens when you've already decided you don't like someone. The clerk glanced at the paperwork in front of her and frowned. She flipped back a page, then another. Same last name, same address. Her pencil paused midair. "That can't be right," she muttered under her breath. "Third time in 2 months?" She checked the computer screen again. The system said, "First appearance." The young man didn't notice she was staring. He spun the pen she'd handed him, scrawled his signature, and slid the form back without looking up. His eyes moved over the room like he was counting how many people were beneath him. When he finally took a seat at the front, he stretched out, one arm draped over the back of the bench, as if this was his living room, and everyone else were uninvited guests. When the judge came in, the room rose in practiced unison. The young man stood a heartbeat late, half bothered, eyes still on his phone. When they sat, the judge started in his usual even tone, reading the details of what sounded like another routine traffic matter. Speeding, failure to yield. Nothing that should have made the air feel this heavy. "Sir, please step forward," the judge said. The young man walked to the podium with a lazy stride, the kind you see on someone who's never had to hurry for anything important. He didn't remove his earbud. He didn't put away his phone. He just looked up, bored, and waited. "Sir, I need your full attention," the judge said, a bit sharper now. "Please remove your headphones." The young man exhaled loudly as if he'd been asked to move a couch. Then, with a small, practiced flick of his wrist, he didn't just take the earbud out. He lifted his hand, palm inward, and in one smooth motion raised his middle finger between them for a split second before letting it drop, as if to say, "This will be quick. You don't matter." The sound in the room vanished. Even the old fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more quietly. From the back, someone breathed, "That's him, the CEO's boy, the one from the news." The judge's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a careful kind of interest, like a doctor reading an X-ray that doesn't match the symptoms. The young man smirked, leaning closer to the microphone. "Let's make it quick," he said. "I've got places to be." On the benches, older faces stiffened. A grandmother in a wool coat shook her head once. Slow. A retired man gripped his cane a little tighter. You could feel it settling over the room. This wasn't just about a ticket anymore. This was about a last name that bought too much and a courtroom that might be the only place it didn't. He didn't flinch when the judge repeated the charge. He only rolled his shoulder, letting the weight of his hoodie slide a little, revealing a thin gold chain at his collarbone. The chain looked young. The expression on his face looked older than he wanted to admit. Most people in that courtroom knew who he was long before he opened his mouth. His family name had been on evening news tickers for years. First, when his father's company went public, then again when the prices of life-saving drugs spiked overnight. Insulin, heart medications, emergency injectors. The kinds of things people in this room depended on. The kinds of things that suddenly cost 3 times more. His father's photo had been everywhere. Sharp suit, knowing smile, the look of a man who counted every headline as profit. Standing next to him sometimes, though never for long, was the same young man now leaning lazily on the courtroom podium, eyes half-lidded, pretending not to notice the hostility aimed at him from every direction, but no one in this room really knew him. They didn't know that he'd dropped out of college halfway through his junior year because the pressure made him feel like he was drowning. They didn't know that his father had replaced disappointment with silence, an absence so loud it filled rooms. They didn't know that the apartment he lived in wasn't his choice. It was paid for, watched, managed, like everything else. They didn't know he woke up most mornings with the heavy sense that if his last name vanished, he'd vanish with it. So he wore arrogance like armor. It fit poorly. But it gleamed. The judge continued reading, but the young man's smirk tightened. The clerk had shifted uneasily again, glancing at her monitor. "This says first appearance," she said softly to an officer. "But I've seen him twice this month." The officer frowned. System must have been reset. But she shook her head. No. Somebody cleared something. The young man noticed the exchange. His jaw moved once, barely, but he kept his posture slouched. Then, from the left side of the room, a voice rose. Unsteady, older, but strong enough to cut through the stale courtroom air. "People die because of what your father sells." He didn't look at the speaker. He didn't have to. The comment hit him like a punch you pretend you didn't feel. His fingers twitched against the podium. His breathing sharpened. The judge lifted a hand, signaling for silence. "Sir, please refrain from comments." The room settled, but the tension didn't. The young man let out a laugh, a short, bitter sound that didn't match the smirk on his face. "You think this," he said, motioning toward his citation, "is worth dragging me in here again?" "Again?" the judge repeated, catching the slip. "This is your first appearance on record." His lips parted, then closed. He looked away, jaw tightening, like a door slammed shut behind his eyes. "Is there something you'd like to correct?" the judge asked. "Nothing," he muttered, voice low but sharp. "Just get on with it." But the judge didn't move on. He studied the young man with a kind of quiet patience, as if trying to see what was behind the grin and the slouch and the lazy contempt. And something inside the young man cracked. His hand came down hard on the wooden podium, one sharp strike that echoed through the room. A woman in the back flinched. The officer nearest the bench straightened. The aggression wasn't aimless. It was the kind that comes from holding in too much or too long. For the first time since walking through the door, he looked up, really looked up, meeting the judge's eyes without the shield of boredom. There was no swagger in that look, only pressure, strain, a trapped kind of anger. The judge spoke gently, almost conversationally. "Son, something is weighing on you. But this court deals in facts, not fear." The young man swallowed hard, throat tight. He wanted to spit out a retort, to roll his eyes, to lean back and pretend none of this mattered, but instead, he said nothing, because for the first time, silence felt safer than his own words. The judge flipped to the next page in the file, the motion deliberate, steady. The young man's eyes tracked that hand as if it were reaching for a trigger. His posture tightened imperceptibly, shoulders squared, breath clipped, a faint tremor running through the fingers pressed to the podium. "Let's try this again," the judge said. "Why didn't you stop when the officer signaled you to pull over?" "I told you," the young man replied, forcing a shrug that looked more like a flinch. "You didn't see him." The judge tapped the folder once with his index finger. "The dash cam shows you looking directly at him. A ripple of murmurs passed through the benches, quiet but sharp-edged, the kind of sound people make when they realize a lie isn't just careless, but deliberate. The young man's jaw shifted, a muscle jumping along the side of his face. He opened his mouth, closed it, then gripped the podium harder. His knuckles went white. "You're misreading the footage," he finally muttered. Someone in the second row whispered, "He's hiding something." Phones angled discreetly, hands half raised, not openly recording but ready, waiting. Anticipation hung in the room like the pause before thunder. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply turned another document over, revealing a single line written in clean, decisive handwriting. Driver appeared impaired. Possible substance influence. The words landed like a dropped weight. The courtroom froze, suspended in a brittle kind of quiet. Even the young man stopped breathing for a moment. He stared at the note. The veneer of boredom he'd worn since walking in evaporated. Underneath it was something raw, fear, tightly leashed and badly disguised. "That's not," he began, but the words snagged. His throat worked. His hand twitched again, this time not in anger but in panic. "Sir," the judge said, voice firm but calm, "this is not a minor allegation. I need the truth." The young man's eyes darted around the room, scanning faces, older faces, tired faces, people who had carried too much and forgiven too little. He looked like a man suddenly cornered, realizing the walls were much closer than he thought. He tried for defiance, but it collapsed halfway. "You don't understand what's really going on," he said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even arrogance. It sounded like a confession without a shape. Like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. The judge examined him the way a seasoned physician studies a patient who says, "I'm fine," while wincing in pain. "Then help me understand," the judge replied quietly. For a breath, the young man seemed ready to speak. His mouth parted. His gaze oftened. A truth hovered so close it almost crossed the air between them. But then he caught himself, snapped back into the hardened version of who he thought he was supposed to be. "I'm not impaired," he said abruptly. "That officer didn't know what he was talking about." The judge held up the paper. "This was noted after he approached your window, son." He observed shaking hands, unfocused speech, and erratic behavior. The young man recoiled slightly, as if stabbed by each word. From the left bench, someone murmured, "He was on something." Another added, "Or running from something." The young man's breathing quickened. He pushed a hand through his hair, pacing a few inches behind the podium, the swagger gone. The room could feel it now. This wasn't the posture of a spoiled heir. This was a young man trying to outrun something he couldn't name. "I'm telling you," he said, voice cracking just once before he forced it steady again. "You're all getting it wrong." His eyes lifted to the judge, pleading, defiant, scared, all at once, and behind that look was the unmistakable truth. He wasn't afraid of the courtroom. He was afraid of what would come out if he kept talking. The judge reached for a second folder, thinner, tucked beneath the first, almost overlooked. The young man clocked the movement immediately. His shoulders rose a fraction, breath tightening, as if he recognized the color of the paper before he saw the words. "This document wasn't included in the initial review," the judge said, sliding it open. "It was added early this morning." The young man's heartbeat might as well have been audible. The room sensed it. His confidence drained not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, unmistakable leak. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading aloud with a measured cadence. Subject stopped near a 24-hour pharmacy at approximately 2:10 a.m. Paid in cash. Request appeared urgent, agitated. Interaction with staff described as tense. A flicker crossed the young man's face, alarm wrapped in anger. He tried to interrupt. "That doesn't mean—" The judge lifted a hand. "Let me finish." The benches were rigid with anticipation. Several older spectators leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes narrowed, not out of malice, but the instinct of people who'd weathered enough storms to sense when lightning was about to strike. The pharmacist reported a request involving prescription medication. The judge continued. Medication not associated with the defendant's history. More murmurs. Phone screens rose a little higher. The judge's next question landed with surgical precision. Are you currently taking any prescription medications not prescribed to you? The young man froze, not blinking, not breathing, just still. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he didn't look bored. He looked cornered by truth itself. No, he said, but the word lacked the sharp edge of a lie. It sounded soft, unsteady. Before the judge could respond, movement stirred in the front row. A woman in her 50s, hair pulled into a low bun, stood with the tentative courage of someone who isn't sure if she's supposed to speak. The courtroom officer glanced at her, ready to intervene. I was there, she said. The room inhaled as one. The judge nodded for her to continue. I was in that pharmacy, she said, voice cracking but steadying. I saw him. He wasn't drunk, he wasn't high, he was desperate. He kept asking the pharmacist to make an exception. Begging, really. The word begging hit him like a slap. His gaze snapped to the floor. The judge folded his hands. Sir, what were you trying to purchase? He hesitated, more than hesitated. He clenched the podium like he needed it to stay upright. It wasn't for me, he whispered. Silence dropped like a curtain. The judge, who'd weathered decades of excuses and half-truths, didn't misread the tone. There was no arrogance left in it, only fear. Who is it for? He asked gently. The young man's eyes lifted, glassy, hollowed, stripped of bravado. When he spoke, the words carried a weight no one in the room expected. My mother. The benches stilled. Even the clocks seemed to stop ticking. Whatever the crowd thought this young man was, spoiled, reckless, entitled. This wasn't the twist they'd prepared themselves for. The judge leaned back, studying him with a new, deeper calculation. Not sympathy, not condemnation, understanding. The young man continued in a brittle whisper, almost too quiet to catch. She didn't have what she needed. I was trying to get it. I didn't have time to. I just needed someone to help. He swallowed hard, jaw trembling once before he locked it again, and in that fragile moment, the courtroom saw something they hadn't seen until now. The son of a powerful CEO standing alone, terrified, protecting a truth heavy enough to bend him. For a long moment, he seemed to brace himself against the silence, as if the truth he'd just revealed had left him exposed in a way he'd never been before. The judge didn't press. He simply waited, giving the young man room he'd never been offered in his own home. When the young man finally spoke again, his voice was steadier, though still thin at the edges. My mother's been sick for years, he said. Most people don't know because my father keeps everything behind closed doors. He thinks weakness ruins the brand. The older spectators exchanged glances, grim, knowing ones. They'd seen men like his father in newspapers and prescription bills. The young man continued, eyes fixed on the grain of the podium. She needed her medication. Badly. The company she helped build with him, before he pushed her out, refused to cover the treatment she needs. Something about internal policy tiers, costs, optics. He gave a small, hollow laugh. My father calls it structure. I call it punishment. The judge didn't interrupt. His face was calm, but his eyes had sharpened, the way they did when he reached the center of a complicated case. The young man drew a breath that shook. I went to her doctor first. I drove over there at midnight. Lights were off. No answer. He'd already warned me once not to stir up corporate issues in his office. A ripple of quiet anger moved through the room. So I went to the pharmacy, he said. I thought maybe, just maybe they'd help if they understood how urgent it was. I wasn't trying to break the law. I wasn't trying to score anything. I was just trying to keep her steady long enough to get her into the clinic in the morning. He shook his head, biting back the frustration rising in his throat. The pharmacist said he couldn't give me anything without a prescription. He wasn't rude. He was just doing what he had to. But when he said no, I panicked. I tried arguing. That was stupid. I know that. His hands curled, fingers pressing into the wood until they trembled. I wasn't impaired, he said quietly. I was scared. And when I left, I drove too fast. I wasn't thinking. When the officer flashed his lights, he paused, swallowing hard. I didn't stop right away because I didn't want to break down in front of him. I looked right at him, yes, but I wasn't trying to escape. I was trying not to lose it. The confession hung fragile but resolute. From the back row, an older woman whispered, "Poor kid." The man beside her murmured, "He needs help, not punishment." The young man straightened a fraction, not with arrogance, but with the clarity of someone who no longer had anything left to hide. My father would never forgive me for coming here like this, for explaining any of this. He thinks the world only respects strength. But this, he gestured around the room, this was the only place I could tell the truth without someone deleting it or burying it. The judge took a long breath, resting his hands on the bench. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd seen decades of families in crisis. "Son, responsibility doesn't disappear because pain sits behind it," he said softly. "But pain doesn't erase your humanity either." The young man's eyes flickered, like a flame trying to stay lit. "This court," the judge continued, "is not here to punish panic, but it is here to correct behavior before fear turns into danger." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "I'm reducing your penalty. You'll pay a fine, but it will be minimal. What I am ordering, however, is 30 hours of community service at a chronic care facility. You'll see firsthand the people who fight for every bottle, every dose, every breath." The room absorbed those words with a quiet kind of reverence. "And maybe," the judge added, voice low but resolute, "you'll begin to understand what power should do instead of what it often does." The sentence wasn't harsh. It wasn't lenient. It was something deeper, an invitation to step out of the shadow of a name that had never protected anyone but his father. For the first time that day, the young man lifted his head with no mask, no smirk, no armor. Just a young man, tired, frightened, but finally honest, meeting the gaze of someone who expected him to rise, not bow, and something in him shifted, not loudly, but unmistakably. The courtroom emptied slowly, as if people sensed the air was still holding the echo of something fragile. The young man waited near the front, not rushing, not swaggering, just standing with his arms loosely at his sides, letting the last of the tension drain from him. When the judge stepped down from the bench, gathering his notes with quiet efficiency, the young man approached. No camera was aimed at him. No audience lingered. This wasn't a moment designed for reputation. It was something smaller and somehow heavier. "Judge," he said softly. The judge looked up, attentive but not surprised. "Yes?" The young man hesitated, strange for someone who'd strutted in earlier with asthma sharp enough to cut glass. He pressed his lips together before speaking again. "My father won't like what I said today." There was no bravado in it, no smoldering resentment, just a quiet recognition of a storm already forming somewhere outside the courthouse walls. The judge slid a folder into his briefcase. "Truth rarely pleases the powerful," he replied, "but the truth still matters." The young man shook his head slowly. "You don't understand," he murmured. I'm not worried about him going after you." The judge paused, sensing the shift in tone. "I'm worried for myself." The words weren't theatrical. They were matter of fact, spoken like someone admitting he'd left a door unlocked in a bad neighborhood. His hands, freed from the courtroom podium, fidgeted at his sides, a faint tremor betraying the fear he'd tried so hard to hide. "What do you mean by that?" the judge asked, voice low, steady. The young man glanced toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to appear. "My father, he doesn't tolerate embarrassment, not in the company, not in the family, and I embarrassed him today." "Publicly!" The judge's expression shifted, less judicial now, more human. "You're an adult. You made your own choices." A bleak smile touched the young man's face. "You don't know what he does to people who cross him." The judge's breath caught, not visibly, but enough that his next movement slowed. This wasn't a dramatic accusation. It was the dull truth of someone who'd lived in fear long enough to normalize it. "This court can offer protection if needed," the judge said. The young man shook his head immediately. "That'll only make it worse." Before the judge could respond, an officer called his name from the corridor. "Them meant fractured, but not completely." "Son," the judge said, his voice carrying the gentleness he reserved for truths that required courage. "Whatever battles your family wages, don't fight them alone." The young man nodded, but it was the kind of nod someone gives when they want to believe something but can't. He walked out into the late morning light, its brightness too sharp after the dim courtroom. The steps of the municipal building were crowded, reporters gathering for unrelated cases, bystanders lingering, a couple of officers chatting near the curb, but none of them were the focus of his eyes. A black sedan idled at the far end of the block. Tinted windows, engine running, too polished for this part of town. As he descended the steps, the vehicle eased forward, sliding into position like it had rehearsed the movement. The rear door cracked open, not fully, just enough to reveal the interior darkness. He froze on the sidewalk. For a heartbeat, he considered turning back toward the courthouse doors, but something inside him knew that retreat wasn't an option. Not for him, not now, maybe not ever. He exhaled once, a thin breath, a resigned one. Then he stepped toward the car. Just before he ducked inside, he glanced over his shoulder. Not at the cameras, not at the crowd, at the courthouse. At the one place he'd felt seen instead of managed. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the sedan pulled away, disappearing into traffic. From the judge's chamber's window, partially obscured by blinds, a figure stood watching. His thoughts carried no easy resolution, only a sober understanding. Some battles are fought in court, others far outside it, and the young man's fight was only beginning.